happy little games. Hello everyone, and welcome to the conversions of Xevious. I wanted to thank everyone for checking out the history of Xevious, and if you haven't, I strongly encourage you to do so. In my opinion, it's one of the most comprehensive looks at the entire Xevious franchise to date. Yesterday, I was at the end of producing these two videos, which I spent about 25 hours on, so I know I must have Xevious on the brain. My wife went to Taco Bell and bought me a Crunchwrap, but when I took it out of the package, the first thing I thought of, which I had to say out loud, was, "That's the Andor Genesis." My wife didn't know what the heck I was talking about. I have always found conversions fascinating, going back as far as when I got my Atari 2600 in the early 80s. There is something so cool about taking an arcade game that runs on powerful hardware and squishing it down to something that can run on the 2600 or Commodore 64 and seeing the results. I'm not sure if you guys enjoy them as much as I do, because it seems a lot of you click off just as I start reviewing them. So if you don't like them, let me know in the comments down below. Anyway, Xevious had a ton of conversions, which is why I wanted to split this up into two videos. Just for the sake of completeness, I did bring over the MSX2 and PC Engine version from my previous video. Let's get this started with a couple of prototypes that were almost complete but never made its way to the retail shelves. The first one we are looking at is the Atari 2600 version, and for the hardware it's pretty good. Right off the bat, you'll notice that your ship has now been replaced by a boomerang and is twice as large as the original ship in the arcade game, making it much easier to be hit by enemy fire. We get the scrolling backgrounds from the arcade game as well as the Nazca lines. The scrolling is a bit choppy, but considering all the enemies on screen, is to be expected. There are over 10 enemy types, and you even get a boss fight with the Andor Genesis. There is some flicker going on when there is a lot of action on the screen, but it doesn't really hinder the gameplay too much. The 2600 does a pretty good job at replicating the music and sound effects, but after a short while, they do tend to grate on the nerves. It does control really good and is faithful to the arcade original. The 5200 was mostly complete, but due to the collapse of the system and the much superior 7800 version on the way, they decided not to release it. Let me just start off by saying the colors are bowling shoe ugly, with garish greens and browns dominating the landscape. Your ship is also a solid purple, making it look like one of those funny little toys you find in adult bookstores. There is also a status bar at the bottom of the screen, which I would assume is to help improve the speed of the scrolling. The speed is also a little bit slower than the arcade original, which is too bad because everything else looks pretty good. There are around 15 different enemy types, including the now blue Andor Genesis. Thanks to the 2-button joystick, the controls more closely replicate the arcade game than the 2600. The music and sound effects are pretty good, so if you are a fan of Xevious, you might want to check this out. Moving right along, we come to the Apple II version. Considering this is running on the oldest home computer, they did a decent job at getting it up and running. There are a large number of different enemy types whose enemy patterns stray from the ones found in the arcade game. The graphics are large and detailed, but the colors are rather ugly. The scrolling is also a bit on the slow side, but once you adjust to it, it feels pretty good. The sound effects are pure Queefhausen with little popcorn blasts all throughout the game. The controls are nice, and you do get separate buttons for your blaster and your zapper. The game had a number of Japanese-only computer releases, so let's take a look at the Sharp MZ700 version. Oh boy. This was renamed to Tiny Xevious due to it only being played by people with tiny brains. In actuality, it was due to it being a stripped-down version in order for it to run on this computer. The game uses a character mode instead of sprites in certain elements such as your fighter. This looks almost exactly like the arcade game if you are wearing your beer goggles. Honestly, this looks more like an ASCII version than anything else. The scrolling is also extremely choppy, but to be fair, it does play pretty good. The sound effects and especially the music made me want to stick an ice pick in each one of my ears. Tiny Xevious was also released for the PC 6000. This one is much better, although the scrolling is still a bit choppy, and due to the limited colors available, the graphics will sometimes blend into the background. The sound effects and music are decent, and the controls work fairly well. Another Japanese home computer release is the Sharp X1 version. This looks pretty faithful to the arcade game, although the scrolling is way too choppy. The colors are not as vibrant, but the sprites have plenty of detail. The sound effects and music are really good, and the stage layouts are very similar to the arcade game. The controls are nice and tight, and for an early computer release, this is pretty good. Released as part of the original 13 launch titles for the 7800, Xevious was released in 1987. This is a fantastic conversion and does a great job at replicating the arcade experience. Due to the lower resolution of the 7800, everything is zoomed in just a bit, limiting the viewing area of the playfield. The sprites are detailed and are well animated, and the background scrolls at a nice, smooth pace. There is a fair use of color all throughout, and everything looks really good. The sound effects and music get the job done, which is all you could ask for. As far as the controls, they are excellent. Switching back to the home computer line for just a minute, we have the Amstrad version. This does a decent job at getting our beloved Xevious up and running. Thankfully, this is not a port of the Spectrum version, as it's built from the ground up and it does run pretty well. The graphics are fairly detailed with plenty of color on screen. The scrolling is a little choppy, but it doesn't take long to adjust to it. The sprites are detailed with plenty of color on screen. The same varied enemy types are available, although the stage layouts have been changed. We even get a bit of sound effects, but no music. It does control pretty well. In 1988, Xevious Far-Draught Saga was released for the MSX2. In this game, players can choose between two modes, either the Recon, which is a port of the original, or Scramble, which is a new mode for the game which includes 16 areas spread over 4 stages, new enemies, new boss battles, and of course the Andor Genesis. There are also 4 different ships including the Solvalu that you get to pilot. In the Scramble mode, you pilot a different ship on each of the 4 stages. A boss battle also takes place at the end of each stage. There is also dialogue in between the levels to flesh out the story. Speaking of the Spectrum, we might as well go ahead and check it out. If you don't mind living in the land of the Jolly Green Giants, then you should enjoy this version. Although everything looks to have been infected with gamma radiation, the sprites are detailed and the scrolling is extremely smooth. Color clash has been kept to a minimum so nothing gets lost in the background for the most part. The sound effects, once again, are pure Spectrum queefy gold, but it does control extremely well.
After these messages, we'll be right back.
重いカルチャーをおもちゃというパックマンゼビウスマッピーそしてギャラが新登場自宅で遊べるナムコット
Probably the one most people are familiar with here in the States is the NES version. Despite some slightly chunky sprites, this is a fantastic conversion for everyone's favorite 8-bit console. The speed of the game is right on par with the arcade and the scrolling is silky smooth. There is a bit of flicker when you get a lot of action on the screen, but it doesn't hinder the gameplay too much. All the enemy types appear to have made it over, including the Andor Genesis. The sound effects and music are almost arcade perfect, and thanks to the 2-button NES controller, it plays exactly like the arcade game. Jumping back to the land of the rising sun, let's take a look at one of the best 8-bit computer ports, which was for the Sharp MZ2500. This version has it all, from the extremely detailed sprites to the excellent color palette thanks to the high color mode. There are loads of enemies on screen at once with no slowdown in sight. The scrolling is also fairly smooth and the sound effects and music are spot on. It controls really well, and it's just too bad we were never given a version this good here in the States back in the day. The good old Commodore 64 version isn't looking too good. For starters, the sprites are fairly detailed, but they are all short and stout, similar to my wife. The Andor Genesis is large, but it has a flattened look to it like somebody took a nickel and ran it over with a train. There is a bit of herky-jerkiness going on, whether it's the sprite animation or just the scrolling, but something is a bit off. The gameplay speed is also a tad slower than the arcade game. The music is only so-so and the gameplay isn't bad, but the collision detection is horrible, especially when you're trying to hit the ground targets. At the end of the first Far-Drought saga, there was a brief message telling us to be on the lookout for Episode 2, which was released on the PC Engine in 1990. Even though it shares the same name as the MSX2 version, this is a brand new game including an original mode, which is a perfect port of the arcade original and one of the best conversions at the time. It also features a 4-stage story mode that's even more difficult than the MSX2 version. The graphics are fantastic and really show off the PC Engine's capability. The music is nice and moody and fits in with the rest of the game perfectly. The Atari St version is up next and it's really good. The sprites are detailed with plenty of color and the scrolling is nice and smooth. Sound effects and music are nice, as are the controls. It would have been nice if mouse support had been included, that way 2 buttons could be used to replicate the arcade game feel. Otherwise, it is an excellent conversion. As to be expected, the X68000 version is virtually arcade perfect. Any fan of my channel will know that this was one serious piece of hardware, especially back in the late 80s and early 90s. The computer and the programmers definitely did Xevious justice because this is one of the best home conversions at the time. The sprites are detailed and are smoothly animated, and regardless of how much action is happening on the screen, there is no slowdown whatsoever. The scrolling is nice and fast and the sound effects are virtually indistinguishable from the arcade game. The controls are smooth like butter and it feels exactly like the arcade original. It was one of the 5 titles that was released in the compilation for Windows entitled Microsoft Revenge of Arcade in 1998. The game was released for the Game Boy Advance but is only a port of the NES version. In 2011, 3D classic Xevious was released for the Nintendo 3DS. Emulation cannot do this justice. This is obviously a 3D version of the arcade classic, which is pixel perfect thanks to it running under emulation. The big draw though is the 3D effects, and they are phenomenal. They added clouds on each side of the screen, which really helps pull the player in, creating an immersive environment. Just looking at it running on emulation, you can see the difference, but to truly appreciate it, you need to see it on a real 3DS. It has been included in various compilations over the years, including Namco Museum Volume 2, Namco Museum Battle Collection, Namco Museum 50th Anniversary, Namco Museum Remix, Namco Museum DS, Namco Museum Virtual Arcade, and Namco Museum Essentials. The NES version is also an unlockable in Star Fox Assault for the GameCube. In Ridge Racer 7 for the PlayStation 3, you get to play a quick version of Xevious while your game loads. It was released for iOS devices in 2012 as part of the Namco Arcade compilation. Here in the States, we received the TV plug-and-play Pac-Man Connect and Play 12-game collection. This compilation includes various Pac-Man games, but also other favorites such as Galaga, Mappy, and Xevious. All of these are running under emulation, so you get the arcade experience at home. Over in Japan, they received their own version of the TV plug-and-play entitled Let's TV Play Classic. There were 4 different volumes, including ones from Namco and Taito. Namco Nostalgia 1 includes Xevious, but it also includes a brand new title, Xevious Scrambled Mission. In this one, you have to pilot the Savalu through a futuristic complex, destroying all the enemies and taking out the boss at the end of the level. Now, I knew there were a lot of conversions to cover before I started doing this video, but I had no idea how many different ones there were, especially in Japan. I hope you enjoyed this video, and be sure and give me a thumbs up if you did. If I missed any, let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Also, if you would like to support me on Patreon, please click the link below. If you would like to contribute but not sign up for my Patreon, you could always use the donate button up above. Thanks everybody for watching.